Hello, my name is Jared Ludlow, Publications Director at the BYU Religious Study Center, your weekly resource for gospel scholarship. And today I'm joined by Sydney Gant, one of our student assistants working here in the RSC. And today we're going to share some thoughts regarding possible resources that can accompany your Come Follow Me readings for June 19th through 25th. These are chapters Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 19. And they all have to do with the suffering atonement of Jesus Christ. The first one is called Gethsemane and Golgotha, Why and What the Savior Suffered. It was written by Bruce Satterfield, and it comes from a volume called The Book of Mormon and the Message of the Four Gospels. And as this volume discusses in other chapters, as well as this one, it compares what the New Testament offers regarding Jesus and his ministry, and in this case, the atonement, and what the Book of Mormon provides beyond that information. So, for example, he talks about how the Gospels do not provide a clear explanation as to the need for the atonement, nor do they present a total picture of what the Savior actually suffered. And the Book of Mormon, according to President Ezra Taft Benson, taught that it's the most complete explanation of the doctrine of the atonement. So the Book of Mormon does more to reveal the need for the atonement, and further it clarifies what Christ suffered for mankind. So Sydney, what is something that stood out to you from this article?
One thing that I really liked about this article that he did was he used both the Bible and the Book of Mormon working together to present a completed version of Christ's atonement instead of wholly relying on the four Gospels or wholly relying on the Book of Mormon. I think something that he highlights really well by using all of this evidence is just telling us that the Book of Mormon is another testament of Christ, and then the four Gospels also provide us with so much important information as well.
Great. So yeah, he's certainly not trying to denigrate the Gospels or say they're not worth reading, but just trying to, like you said, work between the two. I like that he looks at some questions that the Book of Mormon helps answer in relation to the atonement, such as, how did men arrive to a state of condemnation in which they loved darkness rather than light? Why has God allowed this to happen? Why must there be a sacrifice for sin? Cannot God simply dismiss one's evil acts when one repents? Why must God's Son be a sacrifice for our sin? What did the Savior suffer? And so these answers help us understand more about the atonement and its place within the divine plan, the effects of the fall, and then how ultimately the perfecting power of the atonement can work in our lives as we come unto Christ. The second article is called Christ's Crucifixion, Reclamation of the Cross. It's by Gay Strathern, a religion faculty member here at BYU, and it comes from an Easter conference presentation. And in this, she points out that being from Australia, when she first came to BYU, she was surprised that at Easter time there wasn't a whole lot of build-up to Easter, such as Good Friday or Holy Week or those kinds of things, as she had seen among other Christians in Australia. So she kind of thought about this, and particularly she focuses on this article on the crucifixion and trying to appreciate more what we can learn about the crucifixion and the way that Christ suffered through this. So she's not ignoring the Garden of Gethsemane, but that's a different part of the atonement. And here she's focusing particularly on the cross, and she's answering the question, why should the cross be meaningful to Latter-day Saints? And before we talk about some of her answers, Sydney, anything that you want to share about this article?
I know you're going to go more into the steps in just a second, but actually one of my favorite things was one of the steps that she mentioned for why the cross is so important to LDS culture. It's actually the last step that she highlighted, which is Christ actually kept the marks from the crucifixion even after he obtained a resurrected body because of just how important this event was.
Yeah, so, being resurrected in a perfect body, he could have removed those marks, but he kept them as a sign of his suffering for us. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons that Gay Strathern sees for why the cross should be meaningful to Latter-day Saints. And by this, she's not advocating that we need to put crosses on all the chapels and these kinds of things, but we should appreciate it. And some of the reasons she gives are the events on the cross are an integral part of the atonement. It's not just suffering in Gethsemane, but it's on the cross as well. Second, the scriptural metaphor that we can be lifted up because Christ was lifted up on the cross is a symbol of God's great love for us. Third, in the New Testament, the invitation to take up our cross was the symbol of discipleship. And then lastly, as we mentioned, the signs were kept even after receiving a glorified, resurrected body. And she concludes with this thought: because of his death on the cross, we can celebrate the grace of his atonement. We can rejoice in God's great love for us, that he would give his only begotten Son. We can celebrate the opportunity to respond to Jesus' invitation for all to come, follow him, and be his disciple. And in our darkest moments, we can find solace and reason to rejoice in the memory that we are engraven in the palms of his hands. And the last article is called "It is Finished, the Divine Accomplishment of the Crucifixion." It comes from Richard Bennett, a former religion faculty member here at BYU, and comes from an Easter Conference presentation. And his purpose for this chapter is specifically to ponder on the suffering and death of Jesus Christ, to consider both Gethsemane and the crucifixion, and to understand that all of this divine drama was an ordained accomplishment. In other words, it wasn't just some event that randomly happened and suddenly came together, but this was planned for long before. Jesus' crucifixion fulfilled prophecy in every particular detail and occurred just as he taught and predicted it would occur. Sydney, any insights you gained from this article?
One thing that he mentions that I really appreciate is Bennett points out that the disciples and Christ's enemies really didn't understand what was happening with Christ's death and his suffering. And he points that out to highlight that the magnitude of his death and what really was occurring was really lost on the people that were present in the moment, but now we have an understanding of just how important this event was.
Yeah, so you can imagine that for those that were experiencing this, it would be hard to have seen Christ so powerful throughout his ministry and then suddenly being arrested and taken by Roman soldiers and others. Why didn't he do something to prevent it and so forth? But as we see, this was all prophesied and was needed. We just have the benefit of looking back and seeing how this all was fulfilled. And so in this article, Brother Bennett talks a lot about all the different scriptures that foretell this event, particularly the suffering in Gethsemane and on the cross, and how throughout Jesus was obeying every word of his Father in heaven. I like his conclusion here. He says, just as Jesus Christ took upon himself the sins of all mankind, so must every accountable human being take upon himself or herself his sacrifice. The crucifixion is not just a spectacle to behold on our way out of Jerusalem, or a mere historical fact to pore over and analyze. Ultimately, it must become an integral, if not the essential, experience of our lives. We may live because he died and was resurrected on the third day. His atonement is as intimate as it is infinite, as personal as it is universal. Though it is not part of our experienced memory, it must ever be ingrained upon our minds and hearts in the very center of our souls.